So this morning, I'm going to do another big picture sermon out of the readings that have been in the One Year Bible. So I'm going to focus on the last chapters of Samuel. If you guys have been reading them, maybe you have the feeling like I have when I read the end of Samuel, where I'm like, what the jack is happening here? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to start, again, big picture of the Old Testament. So most of the Old Testament, but this book of Samuel was actually put together when the Israelites were in exile. So we start the Bible, we've got Abraham. And then Abraham God promises him land. That's one of the big promises. He promises him descendants like the stars, and that you're going to have this land, and it's going to be for you. So then his descendants multiply, they become Israel, they become slaves in Egypt, and then they have the Exodus. So Moses leads them out, and they go in and they take the promised land. So very exciting. And then we see the kingdom is united under kings, under Saul and under David. So that's kind of really brief summary of what we've read so far. And then you're going to keep reading. It splits into two kingdoms, and they are not faithful to God. And as a consequence, first, what you see is God is patient. They are not faithful at all, and God is very patient. Over hundreds of years, God delays consequences, but eventually the consequences catch up to them, and they are exiled. So what that means is that they're refugees in a foreign country. They're taken away from their home, they're taken away from their land, away from their culture, and they're basically going, what now? They thought that God favored them, that they were God's particular, special people, and the sign of that was that they had this land. The sign of that was that they had the temple, they were going to worship God. They believed there's a promise in 2 Samuel 7. God makes a promise to David, and there's a bunch of different things. But the last part is 7:16. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Now, we as New Testament Christians can look at that and go, yeah, because Jesus was a descendant of David, and so Jesus is on the throne forever. We kind of understand the long picture of this. However, they didn't know about Jesus yet. This was several hundred years before, and so these people were going, okay, what? Like, we thought that this was promised, but now we're in exile. So has God totally forsaken us? Do we even bother worshiping God now? Does God still love us? Because they had this promise of land. They also had the promise isn't the right word. They had the expectation of consequences. God had been clear all along with them. If you are not faithful, there will be consequences. It will be exile. But I don't think that they really took that too seriously. And there was no path laid out for them. How do you follow God in exile? There was no further promises for them beyond that. So these people are refugees, foreign country. Has God abandoned us? What do we do now? And so people were searching the records. They were searching, what's our history with God? How do we follow God now? And so these books, the books you're going to read next, probably started already, in Kings was put together in this time, and Samuel was put together in this time. So part of what they're asking is like, what went wrong, right? The people who are putting these together are going, we still believe that God's faithful, but how? How do we interpret our present? So this would be, when you read through, sometimes you'll see references to other books. Like, I think in Kings, it's basically like every time they're like, is this not recorded in the books of the Annals of the Kings? And you'll see other references to other works. Sometimes these are like source books that they're using. But sometimes it's also just like they took the material and they just put it here. They put in a couple editorial comments so that present day people will understand, not our present day, but present in exile. It's a little confusing. But, so this would be like if I was to look around today and I was like, okay, how do I compile a history of the explorers who first came to Canada? How would I compile a history of the people who started Canada as a political nation so that I can understand like what is happening with the Indigenous people today? I would be like going back and I could search the records and I could put together like, here's what this person said and here's what that person said. And I put it together in a book to be like, okay, here guys, here's the history so that now you can understand. I'm probably not that good, but let's say I was a historian, put it together and say, here's a history so that you can understand what is happening today. So that would be kind of an example, like what it would be like for the people reading Samuel. Okay, the goal, and keep this in mind, the goal of these inspired writers was to help people see who God is and how they were supposed to follow him. So let's summarize. If you've been reading 1st and 2nd Samuel, it's mostly like a coherent story, right? Like you kind of see, okay, there's Samuel leads to Saul kind of sucks a little bit, and then David comes in, and David's this amazing hero who's faithful to God, and most of what he does is pretty great, and then things go a little wonky with his family, but David's a good king. And then you get to the last few chapters, and there's just kind of some like weird stories that kind of feel tacked on to me. When you read it, you're like, this doesn't seem like it fits here. When did this happen? I don't understand. So the way that I understand, do we have any, tell me, please tell me. We've got like a couple Lord of the Rings nerds in here. Anybody? Okay. So the first time I read the books, I was quite young, and it was big books for me. And I got to like halfway through that last book, and then all of a sudden the story's over. And I was like, what? Cool. Like I thought I was, but what happens when you get to the last book is the last half of the last book, it's all like appendixes. So he really created a world. And so it's not like the story's over. Frodo has went to Mordor and conquered the evil one, and he's gone back home. All that stuff has happened. But then there's a whole like appendix, which like, I don't know, most stories don't have appendixes. But it's like, okay, here's like pronunciations in Elvish, in case you care. Here's a couple of side stories about the characters that they don't really fit in the bigger story, but if you want to know some more of the mythology, here's some of these stories. And so you can read that if you want. It kind of adds to the whole world. And so when I was reading this, I was like, this kind of feels a little bit like that. It's like, here's some side stories about David that I want to add in, but they didn't really fit in that overall kingdom narrative that was being told. Does that make sense to the non-Lord of the Rings nerds? Okay, I'm not judging you, So, this main story, I'm going to make a lot of comparisons today, you guys will see. The main story about David's glorious kingdom, this would have been kind of handed down. People would know this history. So I'm going to go back to my colonial comparison. So I learned in school about the like great explorers and like the great political leaders who put together our great nation. So anybody kind of my age and older, probably that's what you learned in school. Now, there's more of a story being told now because we're going, oh, actually, like there's some fractures, and some of these people weren't perfect. Some of these people made mistakes. Some of these people had side agendas, we'll say. Because I'm not preaching a colonial message today, I'm just trying to make a comparison. So it would be like everybody knew that kind of great story about our great nation. And if that's all you've been taught, then you're like, well, why are people upset? Like, they made agreements and like everything's fine, everything is fair, everything's good. And so the Israel kind of knew David's story was great. Like, David's good. And so that story is told. There's some hiccups in David's story. We all read about Bathsheba, I think. That, he wasn't totally perfect, but it's there. But then also, when these original authors were looking, they were like, oh, but also there's records of these other stories. There's records of the famine and all of this. So these stories do a few different things. One of them is that they foreshadow hope. There's David's prayer, where it's reiterated about David's throne being forever, which still would have been confusing, but it's there. There's also, at the very end, there's this story about David building an altar, which is a little weird, but part of that story is he buys the land, and what most of us maybe don't know is that's the land that became the land of the temple. So that was the site. He purchased it, he did it fairly, and eventually the great and glorious temple was built on that land. So when you would read that, you would kind of feel like hopeful a little bit. It also reminds us of David's failures. Do you read the list? There's a list of David's mighty men. So it's like, oh, there are all these great people that served David. It's chapter 23. It's all the amazing men, and tells even some of the stories of some of the incredible people that served David. And so this would reflect really well on David, like he had these incredible people who served him. What a great king. And you're kind of reading it, and then all of a sudden, the last guy, Uriah the Hittite, I kind of hear that, where it's like, okay, like you're playing some nice music, and then all of a sudden somebody hits this really bad wrong note, bang! Because we remember Uriah was a mighty man who served David, and David murdered him to cover up his sin. So the author's doing something here with this list of mighty men. It's not like, it's trying to go, well, yeah. But also, he's trying to remind you a little bit of David's failures. There's also some stories here that are like, just, I think, really bewildering. And I don't think they would have made a lot more sense to the people that were reading them at the time than to us. So there's this story about the revenge on Saul's descendants. That's chapter 21, where the Gibeonites come in and they're like, oh, but Saul did us wrong. And so David's like, sure, here's 7 of his descendants. You can kill them. And then the mom defends the bones. And it's like, wow, like what an amazing mom, and that sucks for her. But like, why is that in there? It's confusing. And then there's the story about the census. So David does a census, and then there's a plague. I don't know. When you guys read that, were you like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I totally get it. Because I'm going to hand you the mic. But, so these things, I don't think, like, some of these would have been a little bit simpler for people to read thousands of years ago, but I don't think that the whole reason why we're asking questions is because we're divorced from the culture. I think that this was part of the author's intention. So here's our question. Why would this non-ending help the Israelites in exile? Yeah, they're still in exile. The ending hadn't happened yet. I think it reminds them their heroes aren't perfect. I think sometimes as humans, I don't know what happens when I touch that. Sometimes as humans, we have a tendency towards nostalgia. And so we can look back at the past and say, oh, like, those were the good old days, and everything was perfect, and it went well, and the people didn't have, people were generally better than they were today. They were more moral, they were more Christian, they had stronger values. They wouldn't have said more Christian back then, but you can hear this nostalgia I mean, I'm guilty of it in my own life, looking back at certain times. I'm like, oh, that was a good time. And then I'm like, I was miserable. But it's something that we have a tendency to. And so this appendix stops the Israelites from looking back at rose-colored glasses. They can't sit in exile and just feel sorry for themselves. When we look back at the past with nostalgia, it doesn't equip us to deal with the challenges that we're facing today. If we look back with nostalgia, then we just go, yeah, well, this sucks, today sucks, and everything's bad, and I'm going to feel sorry for myself and everyone around me. But the past, looking at the past with an honest lens, can actually really give us courage to go forward today. I think that this ending of the book, this ending of the story of David, it would give the Israelites some courage to ask questions, right? They're not at the end yet, and they need to be able to say, God, what is happening? This gives space to wrestle with who God is and really what he's done in history. It gives them space to say, okay, like, that maybe wasn't the perfect apex of what the Israel's history is, and now Israel is done, right? Again, we all know, like, the best is yet to come for Israel. We all know a little bit more. We don't know the whole story, probably. I mean, we know the bones, but we know now, like, okay, like, through Israel, Jesus came and Jesus redeemed the whole world, and here we all are as part of spiritual Israel thousands of years later. Okay, we've got that. But again, take it back. These guys didn't know that, and I think it must have been tempting. There's I think it's a psalm, and it's like, you know, when we sat by the river and wept. It goes on to say, you know, they remembered God and what he did, but I just imagine them doing that, sitting by the river, that they were weeping. They were remembering how the good old days had been, and now trying to figure out, how do we go forward? Now, for us today, we have doubts. I think this is one of those things where, okay, we can look at the Bible, and then how do we bring it for us? I don't know about you, but I've had doubts. I've had questions. I'm a big question person, always have been. It's, you know, from when I was little, always want to know. What do we do with those? I think we can have a couple different versions of faith where either these doubts are welcomed or when they are shoved down. Usually, once we've decided to follow God, once we're in that situation where we're following God, the doubts come because of a couple different things. They come because either of a big event. Sometimes, like these guys were exiled, so then they're like, what do we do now? So some of us have had some major events happen in our lives that have made us question God and question, how do we follow God now? What does that look like? Sometimes it just happens because of the grind of life. You have little event upon little event upon little event that kind of make you go like, is this a fair universe? Like, can God really be good when, you know, list all the things. I think we're left with a couple of options when we have these doubts. The first one is to just walk away, to be like, nope, this isn't a fair universe. I don't want to deal with this. God, there's no way that this can be true and God can be good and worth following. So that's option one. Option two is that we can just ignore it. We can pretend we don't have these doubts. Maybe we don't know how to voice them. We don't know how to wrestle with them. We don't know where is a good place to ask our questions. And so we can just pretend like, nah, I don't want to deal with that. I have a paper that I need to find, and I'm slightly afraid I've lost it. I don't need it yet for a couple months, but I'm slightly afraid I've lost it. And so I'm procrastinating looking for it because, you know, it might be good news, but I'm afraid it's bad news. But once I look, then I'll know, right? So we can be like that with our doubts. We're just like, no, just put that over here and pretend it's not there. But the result of that is that our hearts get cold in those places. Our hearts get hard, and we don't have a relationship with God in that area of our lives, and we refuse growth in that area. Okay, option one, walk away. Not great option. I'm not encouraging that as a good option. Option two, cold heart, dead heart. No, I'm not. Bad option. Okay, I'm going to propose option three. To dig into our faith tradition with questions. I want to propose that asking questions is actually an act of faith. Asking questions shows that you believe God has answers, that God cares about your questions, right? Like if Sean's just been ignoring me, like I'm not going to go talk to him anymore. I'm like, Sean doesn't like me. I don't have any faith that Sean likes me, and I'll just like, whatever, let it go. But if we believe that somebody's interested in us, then we're going to go talk to them. We're going to go talk to them and be like, hey, like I have something to say, and Sean might be interested in that, because in the past when Sean's talked to me, he's like, it's been a good conversation. It's like that with God. If we don't believe that there is an answer, if we don't believe God cares about our doubts, we're not going to ask it. But when we have these big questions, when we have these big questions, we take them to God. Coming to God with our doubts, that's an act of faith in itself, because God is always bigger than we expect. God is always more than we expect. And we just haven't encountered him in that place yet. Some of that is why these questions and why these doubts come up. Be clear, I'm not saying it's going to be like that. But this is like me. I'm afraid I've lost the envelope, so I'm afraid it's a bad answer, so I'm not looking. Eventually I have to do it one way or another. But if I had more faith that it was there, I would have looked last week. I want to propose, through looking at this book of Samuel, this book of 2 Samuel, that there is a precedent set in the Bible to seek God when our circumstances and experiences no longer allow us to believe as we have. That there is a place for us to look and to say, God, like, who I've known you as doesn't fit in this world that I'm living in now. Can you show me a bigger picture of yourself? We do this, for me, it's like study. I'm a study person. So you can do this through study. You can do this through worship. You can be in a place of going, I don't understand, and still singing the, like, God, I still believe you're good. I believe there's going to be victory in this place. You can do this through prayer. Again, just talking to God about your doubts, talking to God about even being thankful for the things he has done. That's a place of faith. Coming to God when you are in doubt with your doubts is an incredible act of faith. And also community. You can bring your questions to people. Again, they might not have answers, but they'll say like, hey, that's tough. Like, let me pray with you. And sometimes, even in just voicing the doubt out loud to somebody else, or voicing the question out loud to somebody else, is the beginning of finding an answer. It's the beginning of experiencing God's comfort in our heart, in those places where we're wondering. So I'm going to pray. And I'm going to pray, just give you a heads up ahead of time. I'm going to pray that when we encounter these doubts, when they come up really sharply, that we direct them back towards God. But I'm also going to pray for the places in our hearts where we've maybe ignored questions. I'm going to pray that God will bring those up, and that we begin to deal with them. So, if you're game, you can receive that. If you're like, nope, we can talk to you later. But just so you're prepared, you can join with me in that prayer in your own heart. Lord, for the places where my heart is cold, Father, we worship you and honor you. And God, we're so thankful for the way that you made the world and for the laws that you set in place. I thank you for the people that you have created who are so creative and incredible and kind and who reflect your image in so many ways. Lord, I thank you for this community here, and I thank you for the ways that you have walked with them over the years. And Lord, I pray for each of them in the future, that when they encounter doubts, when they encounter questions, when they encounter circumstances that are just impossible to navigate, that you will give them courage to look to you, that you will give them courage to take the path of faith, to dig into those doubts and have an honest relationship with you. And Lord, I pray for all of our hearts, for the places where we've chosen not to look, where questions have come up and we've decided to turn our face. Lord, I pray that you would bring those questions up in the weeks and months to come. Lord, we trust you that you are gentle in your timing, that you are faithful and that you love us. Lord, and would you bring those things up in a way that allows us to investigate those doubts? Would you bring back to life the places where our hearts are cold because we have looked away? And Lord, would you strengthen our faith to be able to have the courage to look to you and the courage to investigate these doubts, to trust that no matter what, that you are sufficient to help us face these doubts, that you are sufficient to have some kind of answer to our questions that will bring us life, that will bring us into deeper maturity, that will bring us into a greater encounter with you. Father, we trust you for that. We trust in your goodness, Lord, and I pray that this will all lead to greater glory for you. Amen.